Welcome to Side by Side, a podcast where I, Robert Kwong, take you inside conversations with artists, creatives, healers, and warriors taking the charge on their transformational story. Each episode features a special guest, space for creative and artistic expression, and reflections inspired by recurring themes and topics for your personal transformation. Today's episode features Tracie Smith, who's celebrating the launch of her brand new Oracle deck, combining her experience in design, art therapy, and coaching. In fact, take a listen to the music you're hearing now. It's in part inspired by a card Tracie drew for me when I asked for guidance a few weeks back. So it's really fun to be able to feature this in an unexpected way. In today's conversation, we dive into her former clinical work as an art therapist, along with her journey in creating this deck to support others in their creative process. Today, I would love to welcome Tracie Smith, a creativity coach, an artist, and most recently, a deck creator. We'll get into that in just a little bit here. But Tracie and I met through a group call that was more focused on intuition, creative expression, and maybe a little bit of entrepreneurship. And since then, it's been amazing being able to see where she has taken some of her visions and dreams that she was sharing with me, I think earlier this year or maybe at the end of last year. And now to see it turned into a thing that exists in this world is just kind of so exciting. And I always get very inspired and excited when I see people going out and delivering on that level. So how are you today, Tracie?
I'm really well. Thank you so much for having me. I believe that was Jess Bubico. I think she was doing a workshop, definitely based on intuition, but I think it was maybe like, calling in maybe some new moon intentions at the time. But it was late last year. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's in a little less than a year now, it's a thing that's being delivered. And this deck, just for everyone's information, is now available on the apps at Deckable. And you call it the Creative Core Oracle deck. Is that correct? Tell us a little bit about where that came from.
Yeah. Originally, I had named it the Creative Intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
I really was kind of focusing in on that intuition and oracle piece. And then I realized, as it evolved and as I was building out the deck and I was editing it, I was really listening to kind of these higher level themes that were coming through and realized this deck is actually not necessarily about intuition. Yes, that's part of it, but more so it's about the creative process in and of itself. And so that I kind of renamed it essentially Creative Core because that's what I think this deck helps folks do, is really connect to their creative core, their creative vision, their creative voice, and the process in and of itself of creating.
So if you were to backtrack and tell us your origin story of what even got you to the integration of like art, creativity, and wellness and personal development, where did that start? Because I know you have a background in something that maybe not everyone has heard of, which is art therapy. So like, where did the interest in combining these different aspects of the human experience, like where did that come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have just been into, personal development and wellness for most of my life. I think, kind of when you're a healer or that your voice, your wisdom, your creativity can help others along their path and help them kind of come to understand themselves better. It becomes your life work, and you are just kind of constantly refining that. I'm sure I'm sure you've kind of found that as a coach yourself. And so there's always been this kind of interest in understanding others, understanding myself. But then there's also been this creativity piece that has always been there too. I've always been, an artist or in a creative field in some sense. So I started as a graphic designer, and got my bachelor's degree in graphic design and entered the corporate world and ran away after about 6 years, because just the corporate culture wasn't necessarily for me. But yeah, and then I found art therapy. Actually, I found art therapy when I was living in New York City during 9/11.
Oh, wow.
And I had this really intense experience beyond 9/11, which was obviously very intense, but I had been volunteering for an organization called Free Arts for Kids. So we were bringing arts to like underserved kids and just making art materials and classes more accessible to different communities in New York. And then 9/11 hit, and the organization asked the volunteers to, go to some of the centers that were doing triage work. And so I got to volunteer there, work with a lot of kids who had lost their parents in the tragedy. And what I came to realize was that these kids couldn't necessarily put words to this experience, but they absolutely were processing it visually through artwork. And that's actually the first time I really learned about what art therapy was. And then soon after pursued a degree in art therapy and was a clinical art therapist for a little over 10 years.
So, what should people know about art therapy that may be a little bit distinct from just anybody gets to make art, when they want to? How do you distinguish the process, the therapeutic process of engaging with creativity or working with someone as they are processing in a creative or artistic manner? What are some things that you would want people who know absolutely nothing about art therapy? What would you want them to know? Some foundations or basic concepts?
Yeah, I think one of the like keys and core foundations of art therapy is using art materials in a way to be kind of strategic about which art materials to use to bring about a certain type of response or transformation. So for example, there's what's called creative arts continuum or expressive arts continuum. And so that would be a different media that can be like super restrictive, like let's say stonework and carving. Whereas the other opposite end of that spectrum would be watercolor, where it's so loose and you don't necessarily know what's going to happen with the watercolors when you're using kind of a fluid media. And so art therapists are really intentional about the not only kind of the methods that they use and employ, but those materials, because they can bring up a lot for different folks. It's actually one of the reasons why I used watercolor as kind of my own kind of treatment or therapy, because I was experiencing a lot of anxiety, and I knew inherently, obviously we all were with COVID and kind of what was happening, a lot of unknowns. But I was really intentional about using that medium because I also really wanted to be able to stay in the moment and see kind of what happened and what evolved. And with watercolor, that's exactly what happens, is you kind of have to stay very present to see how this painting evolved, to see how the color develops. And so that's an example, kind of using myself, of how I might use different materials. But I tell you, with a lot of kids I worked with who had a diagnosis of ADHD or maybe some hyperactivity, a lot of times we would use glue and tape and kind of use things to kind of create a sense of grounding and kind of
Hmm.
fixing into a space. And so we did a lot of also work with our hands. We would use in terms of uh, media that wasn't super restrictive, like that stone carving I was talking about, but something more along the lines of a plasticine, which is not as squishy as Play-Doh, has a little bit more resistance. And so for my kiddos that had, kind of some ADHD or even some behavioral challenges, it allowed them to really kind of squish in there and have a little bit of resistance. So if they were experiencing anxiety, they were experiencing anger, anything like that, they could put it right into the clay. And then create from there. So they're able to kind of move this energy through the art material.
Yeah, that's so fantastic. And I love how accessible it is to people of all age groups,
Mm-hmm.
including the elderly. Art therapy has been used to work with a wide range of people at different places in their life, including with children as well. Um, you and I had talked about this, separately, but what were some of the formative experiences that you got out of working with children specifically? And something I'd be interested in is like working with kids who are neurodiverse and working with
Mm-hmm.
kids who take in information and process their emotions in different ways, especially when they just haven't had the language foundation that an adult
Mm-hmm.
would be expected to have, right? So,
Yep.
um, you've already shared quite a bit about this, but I'm really curious about like big formative moments or anything
Mm.
that you walked away from feeling like it really informed everything after your work working with children.
Oh, that's a tough one. There's so many lessons.
I know,
um,
I was gonna say.
so many lessons. And I was just so humbled by the experience of working with kids. A lot of the work that I did with them was trauma narratives, especially for kids experiencing sexual abuse and assault. Um, and so uh, those were the most profound experiences, both I think for me and for kiddos, but to be able to externalize their experience, put it, on paper in a sculpture, and again talking about like moving that energy out of their body. Once they're able to externalize it and kind of see it as almost a story or a narrative, then they can be able to start to shift that narrative or that experience. And there were a lot of different ways we did that, but that would be an example of when I might not use a certain material with a certain audience or population, especially when I'm really working to develop trust in a relationship. For a kid who's overstimulated, had a lot of trauma experiences, and is kind of symptomatic, ultimately I wouldn't want to start off with paint or any sort of fluid medium, because that really puts us super in touch with our feelings immediately. I would want to start with something. Actually, one of the things that I was a kind of an experiential or a directive that I'd often do with kids experiencing trauma is we'd create houses out of cardboard, create safety, create structures, um, and then kind of work from there to kind of create this environment of safety for them, whatever that looked like. Um, I don't know if I fully answered your question, but
Well, I mean, it's
um,
such a
yeah.
broad one, but thank you for sharing some of the, I mean, we forget sort of the power and the impact of doing this work as well. So thank you for
Hmm.
bringing some of that, the level to which we can be with someone inside
Yeah,
these containers that are sort of that are self-created in many ways. We're created in partnership, right? Um,
absolutely.
and how deep you can get, surprisingly. And I always found it interesting that, you know, it's often been said that kids are most naturally creative. They're the most unblocked
Hmm.
or even the most intuitive, right? And it is the adults having gone through some life, a little bit of ups and downs, that often we have a story as adults about having difficulty tapping into our creative expression, tapping into the things that we used to be naturally good at, but now they don't really quite fit in our life. And as adults, we have all these like stories of resistance and blocks around something that kids are more naturally attuned to, generally speaking. I'm really curious about your perspective on this and why that might be. And also, given that you're a coach working around this, some ways that you recommend
Hmm.
adults tackle this work, despite being adults.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it depends. I think there are definitely a lot of kids that are like fully present in their bodies. They are absolutely can be more creative, absolutely, because they're kind of creating their own worlds. Like when they're kids, they're trying on different things, right? And so a lot of times we get to the point where we're an adult where we're like, okay, I've tried on all the hats, I know how this works. It's like we become really rigid in our thinking. Um, and so I think one of the things that one of the techniques that I like to use is really just to get to the heart of kind of that play um, energy that so many kids have. Um, and, obviously, kids aren't always in that space either, right? They can be influenced by their environment, especially if there's a lot of anxiety in the household or whatever, or stress. Um, but as an adult, one thing that we can do, and I do share this with my clients a lot, is doing something very childlike, which is like a scribble drawing. So using like a material that doesn't feel like, oh, this is like a really expensive art material, I don't want to use this, you know what I mean? So it's really accessible. You could use markers or use crayons, and get as big a piece of paper as you possibly can. And you have that on your desk, you have your crayons, and just stand up and just create just a squiggle drawing, or just like scribble to your heart's content, especially if you're experiencing a lot of anxiety in the moment. It moves the energy and it breaks the spell.
I was picturing myself doing that as you were talking, and I immediately was like, wow, I need to work on my self-judgment, because I could picture myself immediately judging myself a little bit, trying to do something that is inherently childlike, you know, in
Hmm.
many ways, right? Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it actually is like that's one of the first phases in my deck, is connecting to that energy. And so the first phase or suit is called create, and it's really connecting to that curiosity, that play, and that energy of just potential, but we as adults try to make it into a thing or perfect it, right? And so we can kind of have this whole internal monologue that is um, critical, and that's also a phase in the deck too. We can talk about that later, but
I'm
yeah.
sure there's a card for that.
Oh,
Um,
there's a couple.
I was like, there are 44 cards, people, plenty for us to play with.
Yes. Yeah.
And so if I was, let's say, wanting to start on a creative project, um, including this one, to be honest, and I'm feeling stuck, or I just have something that I'm trying to figure out that's in the way of getting something
Hmm.
started that's creative, how might they use a deck like yours to inspire themselves? How might they frame
Yeah,
it when they're drawing cards and things like that? What would be a process that you recommend to start with?
sure. I mean, you could do just a single card draw, and I literally do this every day, sometimes multiple times. Um, but we'll just ask the question, where am I at in my creative process right now? Where am I at? And inevitably I'm like, yep, all right, I didn't want to admit that, but there I am. Or, the other response is, oh, okay, yeah, that is where I am. It's kind of more on the positive, exciting end of it. But so folks can use the deck like that. I also have a few special spreads or layouts. And there's a 3-card one I call it, which is at this point and at this juncture, it's named Transformation One.
I love
Um,
it.
I haven't, fully, tweaked the wording there, but so the spread goes something like this. It's the same question, which is, where am I at in my creative process today? The next card is, where am I being invited to grow? Kind of where might I be experiencing resistance? Um, and then the last card is, what am I being asked to or invited to accept and learn more about? So there's that. There's kind of these beautiful spreads in there, these custom spreads, but then there's also the single card you can use, and you can also use the deck and just go in order and reflect on that each day if you'd like to do it that way. Um, and as you did in one of our previous talks, when you pull a card, um, it's doing reflection work or doing response art based on that particular card can just help you go so much deeper into where you are in your creative process.
Yeah, absolutely. I love doing that, by the way, and it's one of my favorite things to do in general. And you were the one who kind of gave a phrase to it that made sense to me finally. It's like, oh, it's response art. I was like, of
Hmm.
course it is. I've been
Yeah.
sort of doing it just intuitively for a while, but there was something about connecting with something, looking at an image or some words, right? Because the card has some words and explanations that can inspire us to be unstuck and to get out of our own way or whatever spiral or thought loop that I've been in earlier that day, right? And then the card I got, I believe, was direction. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's okay to take a new direction. You can't
Mm-hmm.
go wrong. So I just thought that was such a beautiful like example of working with something like that in a creative way that doesn't have a strict outcome based, result based
Mm-hmm.
process, but it's really something that's an exploration, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that. It's an exploration. Yep.
Yeah. Well, so how can people find both the deck and how can people find you online?
So they can go to my website, creativecorewellness.com. You can find me on Instagram, creative_core_wellness. There's a lot of underscores in there, but you can find me on Instagram there. Um, and I'm building out some prints and products right now. So that's been really fun. And so you can definitely find the deck there, but you can also, like, you might be super inspired by one of the cards. Right now there's a limited set of prints that I'm doing, but on kind of greater themes or topics like change in general. That's one of my favorite cards. So there's this watercolor that has like all these mysterious little colors in it that I did not expect that it would come out the way it did. And so that's the message behind that particular card is, this looks different than I thought it would, you know? And often
Mm.
when we experience change, it absolutely does look different than we think it's going to. So some kind of like some cards around like kind of bigger picture themes like change, like vision, and like really holding tight to our vision, but also letting the process evolve. So in process is another one of my favorites, that's going to be available on the site very soon as a print, and also as like a cute little pencil case and a magnet and a sticker.
I
So
love
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I can't wait to get some of those materials actually, and looking forward to using your deck more and more because I am a deck and a card lover of sorts. So I got so excited being able to integrate a new kind of pool of deck created by another creative. So thank you so
Awesome.
much for taking the time out to speak with me
Yeah.
today.
Oh, I meant to tell you too. Sorry, I forgot that
Yeah.
on the deck is out digitally, on Deckable right now. And
Yes.
yeah, so Deckable is it's a new platform. It's basically the Audible for decks, for card decks of all kinds. Tarot, oracle, coaching, wellness, therapy, like honestly anything and everything. So check it out on that platform too.
Yes, you can check it out online, get it on your phone or any
Mhm.
devices, and then soon to be, you can get it in print and
Uh-huh.
have your own very copy. So
Yeah,
thank you so much, Tracie.
thank you. This has been great.
Tracie shared many insights today based on her wealth of experience. I was particularly struck by the idea of being intentional about the materials we use for our creative process. The material could be a guitar and pen and paper, or maybe it's just conversation. We can even use our whole body as material in artistic and therapeutic ways. So, with that in mind, I invite you to consider the following. What materials do you use in your life as part of your creative process? Name as many as you can think of. What is it like working with those materials? For example, I might describe playing the piano as full-bodied, while writing and journaling as more cerebral. Thank you so much for tuning in, and if you'd like to share your creative process, please email robert@robertkwongcoaching.com. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to stay connected, you can find me at robertkwongcoaching.com and on Instagram at robertkwongcoaching.